Welcome, welcome to the second government video. In this video, we'll be talking about everybody's favorite policies, taxes, right? Everyone loves to be taxed or subsidized. I like subsidies a little bit more. We're going to talk a lot about some rules, the graph, and the pros and cons of these. And then at the end, I'll do a comparison across policies. I'll compare a tax and a price ceiling. That's not the only policy comparison we could do, so you should be prepared to think through the comparisons across all four of our policies we've discussed on an exam. So because there are lots of different graphs, basically the impact will depend on how steep and how flat our curves are, and a little bit the graph will look different if we tax producers or consumers. So I do many more examples of tax and subsidy in the optional videos, about 10-minute videos on Moodle now. You could watch me do a couple additional graphing examples, especially if you want to see me do a subsidy, because I'm just going to do a tax in this video. We'll do a subsidy in class together on Monday and then on the practice exam as well. So that's what we're doing in this video. That's what we're not doing in this video. What is a tax? The tax, our definition of a tax, is going to be when the government collects a per unit charge from buyers or sellers in a market. So for every unit of a good that you buy or sell, you have to pay lovely Uncle Sam a set amount of money. So there are lots of examples of these kinds of taxes. So one that the state of Maine is thinking through right now is recreational cannabis, recreational marijuana. We're up here. This is an interesting graphic that shows what the price of cannabis is in every state and whose is the most expensive, and it's largely dictated by the amount of tax the government puts on it. And then a lot of the taxes we hear about are things like income tax. So because of the pandemic, it's been really hard for Maine workers to understand how and where they should be reporting their income, because more people are working remotely, etc. We're going to talk in this class a lot about taxes that affect specific markets, because in our model of supply and demand, we need there to be a good that we can write down there on the x-axis. So we're not going to think much about like property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. We'll talk more about those in macroeconomics. We're going to talk about things like sin good taxes that affect a specific market, like the market for soda or alcohol, cannabis. And that's where we'll be focused in this class. A subsidy is the opposite. So instead of the government collecting something like they do with a tax, now the government offers something, a per unit payment to the buyers or sellers in a market. There are lots of markets in the United States that are subsidized. Example is electric cars. So California has a state subsidy on electric vehicles. There used to be federal government subsidies, but those have been phased out for large part. Sprint apparently took millions in federal subsidies for services it didn't provide. Been a big lawsuit by the FCC. So many companies get subsidized by the government if they provide essential services like cell phone service in remote areas. They'll get paid to do that because they don't make enough money charging their customers for it to be worth it for them unless the government steps in and subsidizes them. So an example of subsidies, electric vehicles, cell phone service providers, especially in rural areas. Boeing gets a lot of government subsidies. Agriculture gets a lot of government subsidies. There are many, many industries that get subsidized. The reason why taxes and subsidies are implemented is usually this story of changing the amount consumed. So you want to incentivize the consumption of a product, then you'll subsidize it. If you want to disincentivize the consumption of a product or the production of a product, you'll tax it. So you're trying to get less consumed in a tax and more in a subsidy. Why are you trying to get more or less consumed? It can typically be to correct a market failure. If you think the market quantity is too high because there are external costs, or if you think the market quantity is too low because there are external benefits, then you're going to tax or subsidize. This is also where our kind of cynical reason and our macro reason would fall in. Taxes and subsidies tend to be a way to fund the government or defund the government. but then also to shift the macroeconomy around. It's going to want to spend more money on subsidies if they're trying to boost GDP, etc. Okay. So there are two really important golden rules of tax and subsidy. The first, most important one is it does not matter who you put the tax on. In our definition, we said you could either collect the money from the producers or the consumers, and it doesn't matter who you put it on. We're going to draw graphs that show the impact is exactly the same, whether this policy shifts demand or shifts supply. So there's a lot of debate often of like, are we going to tax the big bad polluters, or are we going to make consumers pay for a carbon tax? Surprise, it doesn't matter who you actually collect the money from. Both groups will share the burden. And the way they share it will depend on elasticity. So it doesn't matter who we collect the money from. The market will make sure that the burden is shifted onto one or the other. What does matter is price sensitivity, elasticity, the slope, the relative slope of supply and demand. So our rule is going to be that the relatively inelastic curve, the steep curve, the price insensitive ones will pay more of a tax. Makes sense, right? If you want the product no matter what, I can jack up your price as high as I want and you're going to still be willing to pay it. You're going to pay more of a tax. And if it's a subsidy, they get more of a subsidy. And that one's a little less intuitive. The way that I think about it is this. If it's incredibly hard for Boeing to ramp up production of airplanes, we better ensure that they, as the producers of airplanes, get the bulk of the subsidy compared to the consumers of airplanes, because it takes them so much time and cost to ramp up production. They need to be heavily subsidized, have their price go up much more in order to crank up production. Okay, so if it doesn't matter who we tax, it only matters how price sensitive people are. Which group do you think the government is more likely to tax, and why? So just pause and briefly answer that question. If it doesn't matter, who do you think tends to get taxed? And by group, I mean consumers or producers. Do you think there's more taxes that are collected from consumers or more that are collected from producers, and why? Just pause. Give me your opinion before you hear mine. Okay, so as consumers, we might feel like it's us, but when I say collect the money, I mean like who actually mails it into the government. When you pay tax on beer, alcohol, anything you buy at the grocery store, they don't take the money from you. They take the money out of the cash register and mail it to the government in a big check at the end of the month. That's because of logistics. There are way fewer firms in most markets, and it's much easier logistically to collect the money from them because you're collecting from 100,000 cash registers instead of 100 million consumers. Does that make sense? There are very few taxes that consumers pay directly to the government. Income tax is an example of one. The tax that you pay if you don't have health insurance, so that anything that increases or decreases your income tax is one you pay directly to the government. But most goods, the tax is collected from the firms. Part of that is logistics. A big piece is also politics. It's hard to get voters to vote for any tax. It's a lot easier to fool them into thinking the tax won't affect them if you say, hey, we're going to tax the big bad firms. You're not going to pay it. We're just going to charge the firms for what they produce. We're smart economists, and we're going to show and understand that firms are going to pass off that tax in part to their consumers. But because it's much easier to get taxes on firms through voters, they tend to be taxed more. I want you to think through this for subsidy in preparation for, I don't know, potentially being asked that on an exam or a problem set in the future. Okay, so because it doesn't matter which curve we shift, but elasticity is really important. For a tax, there's going to be 4 possible graphs. They could tax the consumer, they could tax the consumer when demand. In both of these, they tax the consumer, and the graph will be exactly the same, except for which curve we shift in the beginning. The impact is the same. And for both of these, the impact is also the same. But, oh, sorry, no, that's not what I meant to say. Scratch, go back. What I meant to say is that all that matters is elasticity, which means when demand is relatively elastic, these two will have the same impact. Only thing different is that here we're going to change supply in C, and here we're going to change demand in D, in A. And similarly, because elasticity is the only thing that matters, B and D will have exactly the same impact. But in D, we will change supply, and in B, we will change demand. Maybe that confused you more than it helped you. I'm trying to lay it out there that there's only 4 graphs I could ask you to draw for a tax, and 4 that I could ask you to draw for a subsidy, but 2 of those graphs are identical to each other. So in the optional video, you can see me do A, and what I'm gonna do right now is D. We're gonna tax the producer when supply is relatively elastic, when supply is flatter than demand. So here's an example of that. Let's say the city of Waterville gets tired of watching people walk around with big gulps. They know that soda is bad for our health. They decide to implement a 50-cent tax. They saw New York City do it, they saw Australia do it, and they're like, yeah, we wanna hang with the big dogs. We saw how well that went. Not pretty politically unpopular in both those places. But we're gonna tax the big bad soda companies. So Coke will pay this, won't affect, InBev will pay this, it won't affect the consumers. Assume that they started at Q star P star that you're given, draw a graph. Okay, so this graph is gonna get a little crazy. I think it's fun, people. We're putting together everything we know about supply and demand. And we're gonna use it. So here's the amount of soda in Waterville. It's our market. Here's the price of that soda. I'm going to think about elasticity from the beginning because I know elasticity matters. Usually on a question, I'll tell you specifically to consider elasticity when you draw the curves. I think soda demand is pretty steep and inelastic because it's addictive. It's a small chunk of your budget. Soda is a pretty big category. It's not like I asked about the demand for Diet Moxie, which for me is very inelastic. It's the best beverage on the planet. You should try it. But I asked about the demand for soda in general, right? So not a ton of substitutes. I think that compared to demand, supply is pretty flat. All of the ingredients for soda are relatively easy to find. It's just some chemicals and some fizzy water. My son wanted to do, my husband brews a lot of beers. We have a kegerator, like a fridge where you can have the keg in it and then pull taps that come out. We actually have a kegerator with 3 different taps. We're not crazy partiers. We just really like brewing different beers. And my son asked for his birthday for us to set up a keg with pink lemonade. And so we set up the keg with different kinds of lemonade, and it was very easy. All I needed was some sugary powder, and then the kegerator will carbonate it for me. So I was practically producing soda at my home. It's not hard, easy to ramp up production. We have seen there be an aluminum shortage this year though. Diet Moxie was not in stock, but in general, usually pretty easy to ramp up and down production. This is where the market starts. There are 1,000 people, or let's say 1,100, that will make my life easier later on. 1,100 people in the market, and people are paying $1.50 for a big gulp soda in Waterville. So this is even more specific market, big gulp sodas. After the tax, so our first step was to draw the initial equilibrium. We did that. Now we need to shift either demand or supply. Remember back when we were talking about markets, one of the 6 things that can shift demand and supply is taxes and subsidies. Now we're going to bring that into play. Because they collect it from the soda producers, we're going to shift supply. Right? We're going to decrease supply because at every price, soda producers should be willing to supply less soda because they now have to pay the government money, mail in money to the government with each soda they produce. So that means supply is going to shift to the left. That's what the tax does in our graph first. The next step is to solve for the new tax quantity. So you just treat this as a shift where there's now a new red equilibrium. And the after-tax quantity is lower than it was before. Let's assume it's like 1,000. I would have to tell you what that quantity was because I'm not very concerned with you doing lots of algebra in this class. So the quantity is lower. Now the trickiest part of this graph is at that new quantity, there are two different prices. We want to look at the quantity where it hits this curve and that curve up there. Where it hits the supply curve, the real blue supply curve, this is a good place to put on your tinfoil hat, your conspiracy theory thinking. This red supply curve is an artificial creation by the government. That's not the true cost of producing soda. That's not what they're willing to sell it for. Their true costs are still given to us by our true blue supply curve. That red one is a lie. So if we want to know what sellers are actually taking home at this quantity, what they're actually willing to sell it for at this quantity, we need to look at the real supply curve. So we plug in the quantity to the supply curve, and that tells us one of our two prices, which is the price of sellers. I'm going to abbreviate it PS, P little s, to distinguish it from producer surplus. I'll try to write it out, P sellers. That's what sellers take home at the end of the day. That's how much they actually earn from each soda. It's less than before because they have to mail in a check to the government. If we bounce our Q tax off of the demand curve up here, the true blue demand curve, that tells us the price that buyers are willing to pay. Buyers pay more than they used to for soda, but sellers take home less. And that, my friends, is called the tax wedge. Uncle Sam comes in and drives a wedge between what the buyers pay at the register and what the sellers take home at the end of the day. So that is going to be equal to 50 cents. That distance between them is 50 cents, not the markup between P star and what buyers pay. So without equations for these curves, there's only one wrong thing. Actually, there's a couple wrong things you could write there. If you wrote something that was $2 or above for price of buyers, that would be wrong. Because that would say buyers bear the full burden of this tax. And also that the tax wedge was larger than the amount of the tax. The tax wedge is always the amount of the tax. So buyers are going to pay something more than $1.50, but less than $2. And to me, it looks like this distance here is much bigger than this distance here. Because the demand curve is steep, buyer's price went up much more than seller's price went down. It's the relative elasticity argument that matters. To me, it looks like buyers pay about $1.90 and sellers take home about $1.40. You see how those are reasonable numbers? The difference between them is 50 cents, the amount of the tax, the part that Uncle Sam takes out of the market. My son has an actual Uncle Sam, who's a wonderful human being. We call him Uncle Swordfish instead of Uncle Sam, I guess, because we don't want him to associate him with like big bad Uncle Sam taking the money with taxes. I don't know. It's a long story. These are reasonable numbers because the difference between them is 50 cents and because the buyer's price went up more than seller's price went down. You couldn't solve for them without algebra, which I will have you be able to do for extra credit, but I don't think is necessary at this point. Okay, so that's what you want to do. The next thing you want to do is use letters, and this is where I start losing people. So like, what woman? I already did a lot. I want to use letters because we need to talk about these areas of consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, and government revenue. So we want to make sure there's a letter on everything in the big blue original triangle of consumer and producer surplus. So that means this area. Also, my B can straddle that red line. Because remember, the red line is an artificial creation by the government. It's a lie from the pit of hell. It's not true costs. It's just something the government made up to make you make less soda. So that doesn't need to have two separate letters. I'm trying to show you where things are going. And then C can also straddle that red line. D can straddle that red line. The prices matter. So the prices need to affect where I draw letters. Everything on either side of a price needs to get a separate letter because it's going to go to different people before and after. E is in here, and teeny little F is this triangle right there. I tried to draw the graph so big and it still is tiny. It's hard with these thick styluses, but happy to do that in person on the board if it might make more sense. So we put a letter on everything in the big original triangle of surplus. We allow the letters to straddle the artificial creation line, and we make price and quantity divide up their areas. If you don't find letters useful and you can communicate to me which areas go to whom some other way, totally open to that. But I'm going to do it this way, before and after. So remember when we say before, we're talking about a quantity of 1,100 and a price of $1.50. Consumers were getting A, B, and E. All the people that would pay $5 for a big gulp and they only end up paying $1.50. Producers were getting C, D, and F. All of the soda companies that can make soda for only 10 cents. Some people say that is like the price of supplying a big cup. It's mostly the cup. The soda and the carbonation is almost free. And they get to sell it for $1.50. So C, D, and F in total. We sum across all of those producers, even the higher cost ones, expensive cups. The total is all the letters. Like I said, in the price control, you want to make sure that your tax total is always all the letters. So the market was maximizing surplus before the government stepped in and started taxing the producers of soda. After, we now have Q tax, and we have two prices to think about. We want to think about the 190 when we think about buyers, consumer surplus. We want to think about the $1.40 when we think about sellers, producer surplus. So consumers get everything below demand and above their price, which is just A. Producers get everything above supply and below their price, which has gone down to $1.40, so just D. So consumers are definitely worse off. They lose B and E. Producers are definitely worse off. They lose D, or they lose C and F. They end up with just D. But there's one more person in the market, and we're going to give Uncle Sam the benefit of the doubt. We're going to give the government the benefit of the doubt and say that the money they take does something good. That the government bringing in tax revenue contributes to total surplus. Money that goes to the government doesn't go into a black hole and is lost forever. It adds to the total well-being in the economy. Some people might think that's a bit of a stretch. That's the most generous we can be to the government in this model. And the government takes in B and C. Government revenue is always going to be the amount of the tax multiplied by Q tax, right? If they take in 50 cents per soda, the government, purple, 50 cents per soda on the y-axis, and people buy 1,000 sodas now, the government gets this purple box. And the government is better off than they were before. Before they weren't getting any chunk of the market. Now they've taken B from the buyers and C from the sellers. But the total is smaller. There's nobody else in the market. The deadweight loss, the difference between the totals, the mutually beneficial transactions that are now cut off and destroyed, is E and F. This is deadweight loss. Okay. little triangle on top is E and the little one on the bottom is F. It goes away, it goes to no one. Those are transactions that don't happen anymore. One other thing I could ask you about this question is how much money does the city take from the tax? Remember I said that government revenue is always the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity of the tax. So in this example, it's 50 cents multiplied by 1,000 sodas, $500. The area from our graph is B and C. So if they took in B and C in total, B is the chunk that came from the consumers, right? It used to be part of consumer surplus, and they sent it on down to Uncle Sam. B is what the consumers pay. And our golden rule number 2 was that this would always be larger for the more inelastic curve, the amount paid. The amount paid by consumers will always be the price for buyers minus P star multiplied by Q tax, which in this case is going to be 190 minus 150 multiplied by 1,000. So $400. Out of that 500, the majority of it came out of the pockets of these price insensitive buyers. C, right, in our graph, going back to our graph, C, this one I'll do down here, is the amount paid by the sellers. That's what came out of their pockets. They used to get C, they sent it on over to the government. C is going to always be calculated by P star minus the new lower price for sellers times the tax quantity. So 150 minus 140 times 100, 1,000, all of these were supposed to be 1,000, sorry, is $100. So this sums to that, but buyers pay more of the tax because they are addicted to soda and it's so easy to produce. We can't tax the sellers much or they'll immediately switch to doing something else. What are the pros and cons of this policy? So for every policy, you need to be able to weigh what do I like about this, what do I hate about it? I think it's a pro that the quantity went down. I think soda is a good with a negative externality, that when everyone is less healthy, we all pay more for health insurance. But some people would argue against me that soda is good and live free or die. So you can choose whether or not you put that in. For sure, we know a con is that consumers are worse off and producers are worse off. There's no redistribution, they're just both worse off. The redistribution that happens is the government makes more money. And I'm gonna put that in pros, but I'm gonna say some people would put that in cons. The government might use the money from this to pay for something you like, in which case you call it a pro. Like if they use it to reduce income tax, we all like that, right? Or if they use it to pay for dog parks, who doesn't love dogs? Some people don't love dogs, and that's fine. Maybe it's a con if they use that to fly on private jets. Maybe it's a con if they use that money to pay lobbyists. I don't know. They're doing something with the money, and we don't like it if it's a con. Pros. Are there any other pros of the tax? Any other thing that we like? Not really. Any other cons? I guess we could say that the deadweight loss going up is definitely a con, that there is this inefficiency in the market. And again, I'm never going to tell you whether you should vote for a tax or against one, but that you should be weighing these things when you make your decision. So what I will ask you is pause and think about this. I was trying to get my students to think like an economic journalist. So if you're a journalist who's opposed to a soda tax, how do you document that deadweight loss? Dead weight loss is not a compelling term. It's not like someone's like, oh, it makes dead weight loss? I'm not voting for that. You have to explain what dead weight loss is to your readers if you're a journalist, right? How would you go collect an image of that dead weight loss that's compelling if you don't want people to vote for a soda tax? What are you going to go take pictures of and explain in your reporting? So just pause and think about that for a second. So here's what I think. I don't think these pictures help very much. You go take pictures of kids crying because they can't afford soda and the kids are cute and it's really sad. But most people don't feel that bad for kids that can't drink soda. Most of us have seen a child on soda and it's a little terrifying. But I think what might work is if you go visit like a mom and pop convenience store and they're like, we used to make most of our money on Big Gulps and now we have to sell the store and close down. All of those big Exxon, I can't even think of the name of a convenience store. All of those AM, PMs and 7-Elevens are going to be fine, but we're going to close down because we can't buy cups for as cheap as they can. That's sad. That's compelling. That's part of the dead weight loss triangle. F, the producers that leave the market because they're forced to accept a price that's so much lower once they pay the government that they can't make it anymore. I think that's compelling. Truck drivers, big consumers of Big Gulps. People you also want to be super alert. So if you find a truck driver that's like, I'm so tired now because I can't afford my Big Gulps. I used to be able to stay awake and drive well. Be thinking this way. How can we put the weird letters that Professor Meredith is talking to us in into the real world, into compelling images, into compelling stories? How do we explain that to people who don't automatically see the term dead weight loss? It's like, I know what that is and what that means. Not explain it as mutually beneficial transactions foregone, but explain it as real world impacts on humans. Okay, so let's compare a price ceiling and a tax. This is going to be worth it. I'm only going to do like 3 more minutes. I swear it'll be worth it. So say the city of Waterville has heard the outcry of its citizens and they're not happy about the soda tax. So they decide to repeal the soda tax and implement a price ceiling on soda instead. Tell me, what are the trade-offs between these two policies and which one would you vote for? So the trade-offs, I think, the tax and the price ceiling are both going to reduce quantity. You can actually draw a graph that shows like, here's our tax, it shifts supply, here's demand. You could get exactly the same quantity with a price ceiling of an equivalent size, right? One that would reduce the price so that they end up having the same impact on quantity. So they're both going to reduce quantity. The big difference on the quantity side is that the price ceiling, remember, it caused a shortage. So that's an additional inefficiency, right? What's that going to look like for consumers? If demand is much higher than supply, we will end up with less soda being bought and sold. But is there going to be rationing, right? Is it going to be like first come, first served, preferential treatment, bribes? All of these additional inefficiencies show up when we have a shortage. If there's a shortage of soda because it's now so cheap that more people want it, then firms will supply it. How does that play out? I don't think soda shortage leads to like violence, but it's worse than the tax, because the tax, at least the quantity demanded is lower and the quantity supplied is lower, and they're equal. So you're at this equilibrium. For the tax, consumer surplus goes down. In the price ceiling, consumer surplus goes up for the lucky ones who navigate the surplus or the shortage and find Big Gulps. So some people are helped. Producers are worse off in both, so that's not really a point of comparison. And dead weight loss goes up in both. You can actually show that it's an equivalent amount of cutting. You could design the policy so that the same amount of dead weight loss resulted from both. The government makes more money here, and the government makes no money here. So I think if you're going to compare these policies, if you're going to vote for one, you want to be thinking about this difference, and this difference. So I want you, I'm never going to tell you which one I think is better. I do think that like this shortage is important, especially for some goods. Like, for example, if this were puppies and it was creating a surplus, you don't really want to see a surplus of puppies. It's just bad. More puppies supplied than demanded, terrible. But if it's soda and there's a shortage and people are like fighting to get the soda left on the shelves, that's an additional inefficiency. But I think you want to weigh the government making more money with some consumers being helped a little bit more by the price ceiling. So think about that. Pause and tell me what you would vote for and why, how you come down on this side of this important soda issue. And that's it for government. There's going to be lots more optional videos you can do. We're going to do lots of examples together on Monday and while we do the practice exam. But I really think this is the most important module so far. So as you've seen, it really brings together everything we know about efficiency and slope, or sorry, about elasticity and slope. It brings together what we know about efficiency and surplus and who benefits, and it ties it all into policy debates. So, thanks for bearing with me. I appreciate you all. I will see you soon.